Hey everybody. Hope you're all doing well. It's been a while. I know I say that on all my videos. Um, so happy Monday night. If you're out there, feel free to send me a chat. I'll try to respond if I'm paying attention. Um, but this video is another reaction video to one of the comments that I got, which raises a couple of interesting points that I wanted to touch on, mainly to sort of parse out a couple of things, particularly the difference between extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing, which I'm going to probably spend the most of the time on this video riffing on. But let me read the comment because it also sort of gets at sort of a difference between T and FE type stuff. Um, But by way of background, so this is a comment from Urban Art Central a couple weeks ago, and they had watched my video, or one of my videos about domain switching between polar functions, like between extroverted feeling and extroverted thinking. So if you've got sort of an FE type problem or a TE type problem, you switch to the other one to try to solve it. And to me, you know, especially when I'm watching typing videos, um, and when they're doing sort of the quote unquote TE questions, if there's somebody who's like an INFJ or an ISFJ where they're TE polar, you see this all the time. And it even happened in my video when I was asked the TE question. You'll see them, those that are TE polar, sort of switch the question or how they respond to the question into more of an FE framework. So, for example, they might ask, if you had a broken doorknob, in your house on one of your doors, what would you do to fix it? And somebody who is TE polar but uses FE in their second slot is likely to have like their immediate response is likely to be like, oh, I'm going to call somebody or find somebody to help me with that, right? And so, and even though it's just sort of like a lot of times they're kind of joking, but they're not joking, you know what I mean? Um, and and my response was sort of similar, like, I'm going to find somebody on YouTube who will explain how to do this. And so, to me, the immediate reaction is sort of like find somebody to help you, right? Make this into an FE issue because we trust our ability to talk somebody into helping us more than we trust our ability to fix the doorknob, right? So if you look at it from somebody who's got strong FE, in their second or first slot, it's really about how much do you trust that function, right? And if you're faced with some sort of TE problem, is it easier for you to just find somebody to help and convince them to help you, or is it easier to just try to figure out how to fix it yourself, right? And use your TE to figure that out. And I would argue that the reverse is probably true, right? With an INTJ or an ISTJ, where they're going to have TE second and be polar on FE. I would argue, I don't know for sure, but I would argue that they would much rather just try to figure out how to do it themselves rather than trying to convince somebody to help them do it, right? Because they trust their TE more than they trust their FE. Okay. So that's sort of the essence of what I'm getting at on the TE versus FE polar shifting. And the example that I use, and I use it all the time, is what happens if your tire goes flat and you don't know how to change a tire. You have to assume you don't know how to change a tire already. If you're FE, if you sort of an FE user and you're TE polar, I would argue, and now it's not going to be true for everybody, but just on average, more FE users are probably going to try to find somebody to help them, um, rather than trying to figure it out themselves. Okay. Now, yes, if you're just absolutely stranded, you don't have a cell phone, there's really nothing you can do, then yes, you'll probably suck it up and, try to figure it out yourself, you know, because like everything, it's not a complete absence of the function. It's just you don't really trust yourself with the function. And all things being equal, you'd rather just not use it and use your FE as opposed to TE, right? So that's the background. So here's the comment. So not really true for TE users. Again, they're kind of, I think they're addressing my, what do you do if you have a flat tire? As a lead TE user, my immediate reaction to the car problem would be which auto assist service to call, how to accurately and completely describe the issue to them, etc. Relying on system and processes. Okay. So I think that's still consistent with the way I would think about it, right? So when I'm saying an FE user is going to call somebody to help, I'm talking about like calling a friend, calling a parent, calling a brother or sister, calling somebody that you can, sort of convince to help you, because it's easier for you to deal with people than it is for you to deal with objects in this sort of situation. Now, calling a roadside assist service, I see, even though you're dealing with people, I mean, that's kind of their job. You don't really have to convince them to do their job, right? That's what they're there for. So I actually see it as more of a TE solution to the problem. Um, and I admit it's a bit of a curveball, but you're not really engaging or using your FE to convince roadside service to come out and help you in the same way that you would have to use your FE to convince your parent, your brother or sister, your friend to come out and help you, right? And that's not really what I was thinking about when I was talking about FE and sort of getting somebody to help you. I mean, calling a roadside service, that's again sort of a process, right? And I get it, if you're a TE user, maybe that is the most efficient way to do it. To be honest, like, yeah, it would probably occur to me that I have roadside assistance, but I would probably still try a friend or something first, because just the thought of dealing with roadside assistance and like filing with your insurance company and all that, just I just don't want to deal with it. But I get it. Okay, so hopefully this commenter and everybody else sort of sees what I'm getting at. That yes, calling a service is technically dealing with people, and yes, technically asking somebody to help you, but in a very TE kind of process way, right? It doesn't take a whole lot of engagement, FE type of engagement, to convince somebody to come out and help you and do their job, right? Okay, so I would still see that as kind of a TE solution to a TE problem. However, I think they go on to talk about, let's see here. They're sort of talking about being hands-on and helping the person. And yeah, if you're TE lead, I could definitely see that. And they talk about how somebody with FE might be hands-on, but only to be helpful. Yeah, I could definitely see that too. I'm most likely to just stand and not get in the person's way, but help them if they need it. But then I think that got their motor running, or their wheels turning on really the crux of this video, is, well, isn't sort of changing a tire more of an SE hands-on tinkering with the environment sort of thing versus a TE thing. Um, and they said, how you describe TE sounds like SE, that is hands-on physically. Okay, so here's where I want to sort of talk about that issue, the TE, SE, and hopefully parse it out. Because I agree, it can it can sometimes sound like me or other people who are talking about the same thing can sound like we're talking about things interchangeably, because it is a system. To get any sort of behavior is sort of a multimodal system, right? And there's going to be different components to it. And when you're describing it, sometimes, to be precise, you have to dig deep and separate out what you're talking about. But if you're just sort of shorthanding it and just saying, yeah, you're going to change the tire, yeah, that's a combination of TE and SE and probably a lot of other things going on. So let's talk about how I think about it and how to parse it out. Okay, so the TE part is the part about planning. Okay, and this is the kind of stuff that a brain can do in a jar, right? Theoretically, right? As long as it's got the sensory input. So if you're going to change a tire or do any sort of TE, dealing with objects, dealing with spatial locations, that kind of thing, and you're trying to get yourself from point A to point B, right? I got a flat tire and I got to put the spare on or a new tire on. Well, you have to think of sequential steps, right? How do I get from the state that I'm in right now to the state where I want to be? And you have a part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that does the planning, and it sort of lays out the different scenarios of what to do to get you from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4, in your consciousness. Okay. And so I think of it as building subroutines or routine behavior patterns. Okay, now it's not the part of the brain that actually moves your muscles, right, and moves your body to do whatever you're planning. It's just the part that's thinking about it. Okay, extroverted thinking, right? It's thinking about how to plan out the course of events or the sequential steps that you have to take. Okay. And if you ask somebody who's TE polar, how do you change a tire? Tell me how to change a tire in 5 steps. They could probably think about it, but there's a lot of fuzziness there. Where somebody with really high functioning TE, lead or second, is probably going to be able to think about the steps, 1 through 3 or 1 through 5 pretty easily, right? Even if they've never done it before. Okay. So that's just thinking about it and planning. That's the TE part of it. The actual execution of it, the ability to focus on the physical environment and manipulate objects in time and space around you in your physical environment, is an action function. And I would argue that's that's when you're using SE. Okay. And SE is very, very complicated if you think about it in neurocircuitry terms, because you actually have 2 different pathways. You have a motion pathway in your brain that goes from your visual cortex in the back up to your parietal lobe. That's sort of your motion. Where are things in space? Where are they moving area? And then you have another visual pathway that identifies what the objects are, figures out their shape, their color, and if you get far enough, towards the front of the brain, right here above your ear, you start getting into association cortex, where you know what the name is, and how it relates to other objects and things like that. More semantic information. So how to identify it. And we know that there's two pathways because there's a phenomenon called blind sight. I might do a whole video on this, where you can take monkeys, or in some circumstances, humans, and if they have damage to the identifying or kind of the semantic pathway of vision, like what things are, what color they are, that kind of thing. They can still react, so they can't see anything, right? So you damage that part. They can't see anything. They can't really identify objects. They don't know to pick the round circle or the square to get the reward, that kind of thing. But if you roll a ball to them, they can catch it, right? Or if you show sort of flashing images on a screen, they can detect where the movement is, but they can't tell you what they saw. They can't identify what they saw. And when it happens in people, the people will report that they don't actually see anything, but they still react to things as if they saw them. Like you roll them a ball, they could catch it, that kind of thing. And so there's still some visual input being processed and affecting their motor behavior, but they're just not conscious of it. So it's a really weird phenomenon. So if you sort of think of SE as dealing with the outside world, I sort of think of it as more of that motor pathway, right? Of interacting with the world. And it's less about, identifying objects and semantic stuff as much, but there's something to that. It's young, and everybody around his time wasn't aware of this differentiation between motor versus sensory sort of pathways, and so it all kind of gets lumped together. Okay, so coming back, I realize I went on sort of a divergence there, but blindsight's really interesting. And so because of that, we have this sort of idea of what people call embodied cognition, right? That part of your thinking is activated by what you're doing, in time and space, and how you're moving your body is affecting how you think about things. And that gets to be really complicated and theoretical, but it's interesting nonetheless. And really what they're doing is basically describing SE, where SE is the action function of interacting with the world. Not necessarily the planning, but once you know the plan, now you have to actually engage with the world and act on it, right? And there's sort of, I guess, sort of mini planning that's going on, right? So you have like sort of the main plan that TE came up with for you, but then you have sort of the mini plans, right? The little subroutines you have, or little patterns of behavior that you have to engage in, like picking up the screw or picking up, the jack, or loosening the screw, all that kind of stuff, like these little sub behaviors that you're doing in the overall TE scheme could be thought of as little SE behaviors, right? Like, if, sort of the immediate here and now. I've got this immediate task that I need to do. I need to turn this knob, or I need to pull this lever. How do I do that? Well, SE is going to do that, and it's going to be taking in the sensory information and helping you sort of engage with the world and act on it. And so that's why I call it an action function. And and you could see how the two could sort of blend together, right? So if I just say you use TE to change your tire on your car, then yeah, it's very easy for somebody to come back and say, well, no, that's more of an SE thing. Yeah, okay. So if you're actually changing the tire on your car, you need to use SE, but you also need the TE to figure out the plan, right? So you kind of have to, so you had to be a little bit more precise when talking about it. And also, as you're listening to me, if I'm talking about it at a high level, I might not drill down as precisely as like a lead TI user might want me to. Okay, so now how do we know that there's a difference between actual planning and then the actual execution or the action? Well, like everything, you can look at neurological patients and find patients that have damage to one or the other area and see what can they do and what can they not do and compare the two. And so, prefrontal lobe patients who have damage to their dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, I argue that's your TE spot, that's your planning spot, how to plan out behavior. They are notoriously bad at planning out sequential step by step. Here's how you get from point A to point B to point C to point D, and have a really hard time, with sequential tasks, things like the Tower of Hanoi task, things like you can give them sort of a a maze or like a picture and or like a graph and say, okay, imagine you lost your key and this is your backyard. How would you find your key? They're just going to draw lines all over the place, where people with really strong TE will have like very systematic way of looking for their key. There's all kinds of, you can find all kinds of examples on YouTube or the internet of people with dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex damage, and and they call that the executive function, the ability to plan things out. There's a lot of different theories about what exactly that part of the brain is doing, and but in the end, it's doing the planning. And one thing, like you'll hear Eric on Talking with Famous People talk about people with TE polar, like INFJs, ISFJs, and like how they kind of just, when faced with dealing with an object that they're trying to figure out, we'll just sort of press buttons and turn knobs until we until we get it to do what we want it to do, rather than sit there and try to think systematically, okay, how do I get this? The example he uses, like, if you come up to a gate or something and you don't know how to open the gate, you'll just sort of fumble with it until it finally pops open. And I have that kind of stuff happen to me all the time, where you get in a new car, you're trying to figure out where the windshield wipers are. You're not like looking around at the the dials or the descriptions. You're just moving levers and you're like, aha, there's the windshield wipers. So it's so people with prefrontal cortex damage to the prefrontal cortex are like that, but magnitudes and magnitudes more, right? You sit them in front of a computer, they just start typing away, and you ask them what, even though you didn't ask them to do any typing or anything, they're just like lock set on, whatever it is they feel like doing, they just do. And people argue that they don't have a filter, to sort of to inhibit their behavior, all kinds of theories. But basically, they just have a hard time planning out TE type of stuff. Okay. Now, they can do the action stuff, right? Like if you give them a very simple task that requires them to use their SE and just, manipulate objects or to manipulate things in time and space, they can do that just fine, right? As long as it doesn't take a whole lot of planning, right? If it's just sort of move this thing to over here, they can do it, no problem. As long as they're paying attention to you, that could sometimes be an issue. But but if it doesn't take more than 2 or 3 steps of planning, they can probably do it, no problem, right? But you have to be careful. It can't be too complicated where they have to figure out a plan using their TE to execute the behavior. But as far as seeing things and hearing things and having all the sensory input and being able to manipulate their environment using their motor system, usually no problem, as long as the damage is restricted just to the prefrontal cortex and doesn't get into the motor area. So on the flip side, you have patients who have damage to the motor area from strokes or whatnot. And at the extreme cases, you can have people who have what we call locked in syndrome, where they can't move anything other than their eyes. Um, and occasionally maybe some, ticks in the face, like smiling, that kind of thing. If you watch Breaking Bad, Uncle Tito, the guy who was in the wheelchair and would just ding the bell, it would be an example of a locked in patient. And usually they can't speak, but what you can do is you can track their eye movements, and you can ask them questions and then have them respond by looking at letters on a grid, by tracking their eye movements. And so they'll basically spell out their response to you by looking at the different letters. Um, and so you can ask them to do TE type tasks, right? To explain how would you get from step one to step three to step four. And they can do that just fine, right? But you have to, I mean, they can't actually physically do it, but they can explain to you if you monitor their eye movement and let them spell it out to you. You can see that they actually know how to do it, right? They have the cognitive ability to do the planning, right? um, but they can't physically engage in the actions, right? So that's the extreme case. But you have other, subtler cases like Parkinson's patients or people with damage to the basal ganglia or other motor sort of learning areas and execution areas where they just have a hard time physically doing it, but they could tell you what they're trying to do, right? Or they could tell you the sequential steps in the process. So their TE is working just fine, but they can't get the SE part, right? To function. And then just people who are blind or deaf. I mean, they're missing some sort of sense, but it doesn't mean that they can't do the TE part of it. So when you're thinking about TE and SE, that's what I would argue the way you would think about it is planning versus action. And yes, when I'm sort of when we're sort of glossing over the functions and not really being very precise, we could say things like, changing a tire is a TE problem, but yeah, actually doing it involves SE and maybe some NE and other ingredients that get thrown in there. But it depends on what were the part of the problem or the function that we're really talking about, right? So, the burden's on us to be precise about it and to say what we really mean. But hopefully this helps sort of parse out the TE versus SE thing. Um, Somebody else asked you a question about TE and objectivity versus TI being subjective. I think I'm going to do another video on that rather than extend this video out. So stay tuned for that. But hopefully this helps clarify the TE versus SE. And let me know if you have any questions, comments, leave them, and I will get back to you. Okay, have a good one. Bye.